Hello, world historians, and hello again for the last time, as this is week 6. A new global era begins. So, believe it or not, this is our last week, so I have a few deadlines, a few announcements to run through before we get started. So, all work for this week's deadline is due in at the end of Saturday, June 25th. So, Saturday, June 25th by midnight. That includes, of course, your final exam. So, no semester would be complete without a final exam. Don't forget, this will be available to you from should be 9 a.m. on Thursday, June the 23rd. But if you go onto the module 6, you should find the instructions are already up there. There is, I should point out, no other short writing for this assignment, for this module rather. There's also no forum for this week, so we're really just sort of tying up the loose ends of the semester. That includes, of course, the comparative review essays, which are due on June 20th. This is where, of course, we're choosing a topic. We're selecting two scholarly sources, that's secondary historical perspectives on those historical topics from 1500 to the present, writing about them, comparing and contrasting those two topics. So if you have any questions about those, please do take the time to email me, and I will get back to you as quickly as possible. I have no other classes running at the moment, so I should be able to give you feedback. Also, one final mention, I should say, of the evaluations, which should be online now. If you haven't already completed them, please do so. I know all professors tell you that this is important, and I know sometimes you can get overwhelmed with evaluations, but this is the first time I've taught this particular half of the World History Survey online. It's also the first time I've taught online using the Canvas software, so you are, in a sense, the guinea pigs for this class. And what I always tell students, but I think is always particularly true when I'm doing things a little bit different for the first time, is that you are the guinea pigs. You are also the folks that are going to be able to provide feedback and to be able to give some kind of indication to me in terms of the videos, in terms of the readings, in terms of the design of the assignments and so on, what worked, what was great, what was problematic, what could have been better, and so I can make this, better for the next group of students who come along and take this class. So I'm going to press on now, and this week we're going to be analyzing the relationship between decolonization and the Cold War after World War II, describing the main milestones in decolonization, identifying the problems faced by newly independent states, which ties in very much to the Cold War, and identifying the challenges and opportunities of the new global era, which of course is the era we live in now. One quick word about terminology before I move on, which is this word decolonization. Decolonization means two things. Number one, decolonization is the process of being in a state of post-colonial political existence. Now, pretty much every country on the world stage at one point or the other was part of a bigger empire. If you think about the United States, for example, at one point the United States had the misfortune of being part of the British Empire. But even the British, even the English, if you go back far enough in history, were once part of the Roman Empire. So in that sense, decolonization, post-colonialism as it's sometimes called, could pretty much apply to anywhere in the world. But we're talking here specifically after 1945. So we're talking about the transition from a world which is dominated by a handful of European empires which have territories in Africa and Asia, to the world in which we kind of see in the latter half of the 20th century, where you have dominance of two superpowers, of course, the United States and the Soviet Union, and a very different world in which these small independent countries, some of them quite large independent countries if you think of India, but some quite small countries in Africa, and also countries in Latin America, which are more have a longer history of independence, but was still part of this Cold War power struggle. where they're being drawn into the spheres of influence of these two great powers. So this week we'll be saying farewell to each other and farewell to the Cold War, which came to dominate the last century. So who knows what the next century will bring? I'll certainly say that predicting the future is always a dangerous business. But there's also some comfort in knowing that the experts can be as clueless as the rest of us. So I have a quotation here, which is from the American political theorist Francis Fukuyama. Don't worry if you haven't heard the name. But he wrote an essay in 1989 entitled The End of History, which is a great and rather ominous sounding title for an article. And this is Francis Fukuyama. He's still around. And what he wrote in 1989 is worth reading out. What we may be witnessing, he said, is not just the end of the Cold War or the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history as such, that is, the end of the point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. So I want you to take a moment to think about what this actually means, what he's saying. It's pretty remarkable. I think in that this guy was really quite a visionary writing in 1989. He really had a sense that history as such was not going to end in the sense that events are going to stop happening. But he believed that the world had come to a point where humanity had realized the superiority of what he saw as the universalization of Western liberal democracy. The West had won, the Cold War was over, and everyone sooner or later would come around to understanding that there was a superior form of civilization and that this was the best way of securing universal human rights, democracy, capitalism. And then, of course, 9/11 takes place. And I don't think since then people have been talking about the end of history in quite the same way. I think even Fukuyama has said post 9/11, and he's still alive and writing today, that the world that we live in today was very different than the world, the rather optimistic world that he imagined in 1989. So there's a lesson there in predicting the future. I think we can always be a little bit overconfident in the lessons of the past when we try to apply them to tomorrow's world. So I'm just going to leave you with a brief overview here, a map of the post-colonial world, and you can see it's dominated by three major regions, three worlds, if you like: the first world, the second world, and of course the third world, which we still sometimes refer to the developing world as a third world. The first world, of course, refers to the United States in blue and its European and other world allies, the Japanese, for example, the Australians, who were dominated and subscribed to the idea of capitalist liberal democracy. But it is also worth thinking, as we're reading for the final exam this week, that the Second World, which was represented by the Red Empire of Communist China and the Soviet Union, was also to many former European colonies was seen as a powerful and even seductive ideology. It was something which had been seen as standing against imperialism. And of course, the experience of many Indian and African and even Latin American people in the 20th century was that imperialism was very much tied to the system of capitalism and European industrial power. So we mustn't assume, therefore, that for the rest of the world, communism was necessarily an unattractive ideology, but we see this ideology, the struggle of ideology between the West and the Soviets and their communist allies, playing out in places as far afield as Cuba, Afghanistan, and Vietnam. So it is truly a global struggle, even though we refer to it as the Cold War. It also encompasses actual conflict. And again, going back to Francis Fukuyama's vision of the future, we have to remember how quickly the world can change. If you go back to 1945, the end of the Second World War, there was no United Nations, there was no NATO, there was no International Monetary Fund, all of these huge multinational umbrella organizations which really regulate the world political, diplomatic, and economic environment. One third of the world, one third of the world's people lived in non-self-governing territories. Usually, we might say colonies. So, India was part of the British Empire. Algeria, Vietnam were part of the French Empire. Even the Dutch, for example, the Netherlands, which is a tiny country in Europe, controlled a huge population in Indonesia. So, in 1945, if you looked at the map of the world, you would see most of it still remained colonial. By around 1970, the number of self-governing countries in the world had doubled from around 50 to over 100. And by today's measurement, if you look at membership of the United Nations, which is seen as the major yardstick of national sovereignty, there are over 200 recognized United Nations member countries in the world. So post-colonialism has a huge impact during the Cold War in terms of feeding the number of countries vying for social and economic voice at the table. World War II itself also continues, spills over into some of these independence movements that we're going to be reading about in these last two chapters in places like India, Africa, and somewhere called Indochina, which is modern-day Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. It was originally a French colony, but of course it becomes the focus, particularly in Vietnam, of American military intervention. So one thing to bear in mind is, why does America end up fighting what essentially is a leftover of the French colonial struggle in Southeast Asia? And the answer, of course, is to do with the conflict of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviets vying for influence. You'll see the Crash Course World History video that I put online this week, talking about the clash of civilizations and this model really having a kind of validity for understanding the Cold War. And then finally, I think we can say that decolonization marks a global shift in the balance of power, and this is a global shift which is still ongoing. So as we finish this week, as we look at the questions for the final exam, I want you to think about what that global shift in power actually means. Who are the winners? Who are the losers? What does this tell us about the state of the United States and the future going forward into the 21st century? So I'm afraid I'm going to leave it here because this is the last week of this semester, but I do look forward to reading your final exams and especially your comments on the evaluation. So please fill them in, and thanks once again. You've been a great class. This has been a very quick 6 weeks, almost too quick, but I'm going to finish here and look forward to my travels going off to Europe on the 28th. But hopefully I will have your grades turned in by then. So thanks once again, and have a great rest of your summer, folks, if I don't speak to you before then. Okay, bye.